See the attendee list growing. Hello, folks. We'll give it a second while we have time for a few more people to jump in. I feel like we need some hold music, Chitra. That's a thing we didn't account for, but
you've got a guitar back there, can't you?
Yeah, I am
start strumming away.
You are all welcome. That I am not going to produce the hold music on the fly. We'll just give it a second, and then we'll get things going.
How's your day going, Rob?
My day is excellent. Thank you, Chitra. How about you?
Can't complain. Looks pretty nice outside.
That's right. Actually, I mostly just see blinds. Put a lot of work into creating a space where there's some soft lighting. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to get things underway, and I'm assuming more people will join, and we'll just they'll catch up. So, thanks for taking the time to join us. We'll introduce ourselves in just 1 second, but we're here to talk to you about CTOs and CFOs working together to figure out, manage tech spend in what have proven to be some tough economic times, and who knows what lies ahead. So probably a good point to talk about this and think about it, and we'll share our ideas, but we'd love to get some feedback along the way and get some questions. And there is a Q&A feature. If you have questions along the way, we'll keep an eye on them and try to dive into them at the end. So let's jump right into intros. Chitra, I'll let you start that off.
Well, hi, everyone. I am CircleCI CFO, Chitra Balasubramanian. It's great to be here today, and thank you all so much for joining. I've been with the company for a little over 6 years, joining shortly after our Series B financing. And my strong opinion on this topic is that every executive, including the CTO, is the CFO of their own domain.
Love it. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Zuber, CTO at CircleCI. I've been with the company since 2014. I came in through an acquisition way back then. I was working on some mobile CI/CD. And I love that my strong opinion is presented, so I'm not allowed to change it. I think that's why it was typed into the slide, because I have so many strong opinions. But for today, I'll say my strong opinions are about undifferentiated heavy lifting. It's obviously a thing we talk about a lot at CircleCI. For those who don't know us, we'll get into what we do just super briefly, but that's not the focus today. It's more this, the relationship and how we work together to drive success overall in our business. But as a provider of tools to help developers move faster, we think a lot about places where you can focus your energy and get good returns, and then places where you can effectively, let's say, spend money, right? Like that's what we're here to talk about, where you can invest your cash instead of your human your personnel, the people in your organization. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So as an organization, our mission at CircleCI is to get to a place where we take care of managing change in the flow of software so that software teams can focus on what they do and innovate faster. Again, we use that expression undifferentiated heavy lifting a lot to talk about the things where people are investing to do things that really aren't differentiating them, when they should be investing their own time and energy on the things that really drive their businesses. And we do this across the globe for many, many different types of organizations, because we know today that every company is a software company. Every organization in every business, regardless of what it is that you provide to your end users, you're doing some part of that, changing the way that you do some part of that through digital experiences, right? Finding places to really make a better experience for your customers by giving them access to a digital experience, and we support our customers in doing that. Right on. So here's an example, or a large number of examples, but again, everybody out there is doing that. Everyone is focusing on getting digital experiences out to their customer, and that's a big part of what we do.
Okay, so maybe to start, we can talk about why we're talking about this topic of spending. I think that you said it, Rob, it's really tough out there. It's been tough. We've all been through a crazy roller coaster over the last few years, but what's particularly been interesting recently is just sort of the goalpost shifting for every company, right? Whether you're an executive, a team leader, someone who controls their own individual domain, you know that the stakes have only been getting higher and higher in terms of the company and the expectations. But that being said, there's also been increased constraints. The market is, again, tough, right? You've got interest rates rising. You've got the funding environment changing. There's been a lot of volatility across different industries, as we've seen. And so, with that, we've all been sort of expected to make a quick pivot to better understand how we can, basically employ not just growing at all costs, but how do we grow efficiently? How do we think about ROI and really get that discipline within the organizations? And, free cash flow is cool again. So how do you think about, making sure that what you do has that kind of cash element in mind, and that we're really being smart about what we're doing? So it's a little bit, I would say, background as to why we're here today. And, I think it's really fun to be here with you, Rob, because I think the partnership is a really important part of how we all kind of get there.
Absolutely. Free cash flow was always cool, Chitra. I could barely spell it. No, but I think that's exactly right. Like, understanding from a partnership perspective at the end of the day that we're in this together is a huge part of it, right? Like, using that cash, using it wisely, making good decisions. And so, as Chitra highlighted, we're deep into a pretty challenging time. On the one hand, it feels like everything changed overnight. We all know that nothing changes overnight, but things bubble up to the surface very quickly, perspectives change rapidly, and then entire markets shift. And so all that has happened as a backdrop from an economic perspective, but at the same time, the pressure continues to increase in terms of one way of thinking about that is we have less to spend, but we're trying to do more. The market is changing rapidly. Technical leaders are being asked for more all the time, despite trying to figure out how to spend less. The pressure to ship continues to increase. Certainly the early parts of this year have shown a massive uptick in concerns about security, which is yet another place to be investing and thinking and putting energy. And then, generative AI, speaking of things that happen overnight or come out of nowhere, has shown up on every technical leader's doorstep as, what are you doing about this? How are we taking advantage of this technology? How are we working differently? It feels like it's about to fundamentally change how we all ship, deliver, work every day. And we're trying to figure out where to put our attention, right? At the end of the day, it's always what kinds of bets are we going to make that are going to be really high value for the customer, and how do we make those decisions? So when we get to that point, I mean, we've alluded to it a little bit because it's kind of clear in how we think every day, but these times, these sort of pressure cooker moments, if you will, really expose how teams function, how people work together, or how they don't, right? Under great pressure, you either figure out how to collaborate or you become enemies, right? The tension can increase or the collaboration can increase. And there's a few stats on here that really call this out. People are expecting all of these different challenges, risks, fundamental changes in business to accelerate, but very few organizations would describe themselves as closely aligned. And so how do we take this opportunity and figure out how to take advantage of it, how to work together to find the real wins and really do what's best for the organization and for our businesses, versus worrying about ourselves, the pressure on ourselves.
Great segue to this. I think the truth is that when we work together, things not only become easier and more frictionless, but it's our way of winning, I would think. And I think often CFOs get cast as sort of in this role of an enforcer, someone you have to prevail over, someone you have to kind of influence to get on your side. But I think that mindset can be short-sighted, and it puts the needs of sort of a single organization or department ahead of the needs of the company as a whole. And I mean, I think ultimately I view CIOs, CTOs, CFOs, CXOs as partners to drive shareholder value at large, right? This really involves taking a look at the company at an even higher level than any particular group or division. So we share the ultimate end goal, but sort of have different day-to-day tasks and different ways that we contribute towards that. I think one of the best ways for a CFO to scale a finance org is actually to be aggressively aligned with their executive peers, because doing that really like frees you up to focus on the big picture and be more of an advisor, right? If everyone is aligned on what the long-term strategies of the company, and also have kind of that understanding of what the financial path should generally be, I think it's a lot easier for executives to sort of make calls without having to go through kind of the CFO police, right? Or what has been traditionally deemed that way. I think it puts the CFO as well in more of an advisory capacity than, again, the cost the cost police or what have you. So with that, let's get into it. Where to start? Do you want to go first, Rob, or do you want to go first on this one?
I mean, I really want to talk. It's funny. I am as you were talking there and describing that, I was reflecting on the Phoenix Project, which I think, like, if you haven't read that in our industry, you should probably put it on your to-do list. But there's this sort of pivotal moment in there where one of the IT execs, goes to visit, I think it's the CFO or the COO, I'm going to say CFO, and basically says, how do you look at the business? Like, what matters to you? And how do I think about solving problems that matter to you because they're reflective of what we need in the business? And I think this was a pivotal moment for us. It wasn't as storybook as the Phoenix Project. I mean, we weren't writing a novel, but there was this moment, I can't even think of the exact time frame, but where we, not just you and I, but as an executive, sat down and said, what does it look like for businesses that are performing really effectively in our space? Like, how would we know from a financial perspective what it looks like to be great? And then how do each of us, and I'll speak for myself as a CTO and a technical leader, but how do each of us around the table contribute to that? How does that reflect back into the work that we do? And I think that reframing, right? We all want to be successful. We know that we want to be successful as a business. We know that that comes from driving great value to our customers. And I think that's another really interesting point in there, is seeing all these financial metrics and not thinking of them as gatekeepers or leading, but we'll know we're succeeding. We'll know we're doing the right things for our customers and that we're driving the business effectively when we start to look like this profile. So what does that look like? Really having that kind of information, and then, joking about being able to spell free cash flow, like actually understanding some fundamental financial metrics, what they look like, why you think about them, and then how I can think about them in a way that then says, oh, great. Then when I look at this particular question, this particular thing I'm pursuing from a technical perspective, then I can frame it in the way that you would think about it, so that when I have a question, first I can just come to you for help and say, oh, I'm trying to understand this a little bit better. Can you help me, look at how I would think about this? I'm not totally sure how to identify whether I'm going to get a good return. I'm not totally sure how to model in the risk or the unknowns that might come up in this case. And really starting to build that model for working came from this, let's just share the conversation about how a CFO looks at the business, right? And what does that tell us about how each of us are doing?
One of the things that was most, I guess, exciting for me to actually watch when we had this conversation, I remember that particular meeting, was we were able to actually, as a group, think about who we want to be, right? Do we want to be in the 90th percentile? Do we want to be in the 50th percentile? Who do we want to be? And typically people want to be in that, the higher echelons of companies, ultimately, because they're the ones that have like very strong valuation multiples, and the what ends up getting provided to the shareholders is very strong, right? So I think being able to talk about numbers in this way makes everybody kind of participate as a team member and someone who really wants to look at these goals and see how they can contribute to these numbers or the strategy at large. So I think that was one of the most exciting things about kind of opening up the dialogue. So it's not just a CFO or finance team sitting there with all of these benchmarks, but something that the entire organization can see, can get excited about, and ultimately make decisions somewhat independently, knowing what the kind of high level constraints and guardrails are. And I would say whether you're, a pre-IPO company, whether you're a public company, I think being able to look at this type of benchmark information, and I would say even more so looking at the benchmarks for companies that are maybe slightly ahead of you, gives you a good understanding or a good way to think about your own path ahead, what your future planning should look like.
Absolutely.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that I keep comparing, because at the end of the day, I love the notion, this like first team, which I think people are very familiar with, that we as an exec are working together, understanding each other's points of view, bringing a sort of a common set of problems and goals to align around. And as a technical leader, I will say this is at a leader level doing the things that I expect from my organization, right? From people in R&D, from people in product, from people in engineering, showing up and saying, this is the problem we're trying to solve. We bring different perspectives. It's design, it's product, it's engineering, but we're driving towards the goal. And for me, a lot of this alignment at a higher level is the same thing happening across entire departments, right? So us all saying, we understand the top line goals, and these might shift, right? These might shift from market condition or economic environment to economic environment. They might shift depending on what's happening in the actual market in terms of what we're trying to deliver. But understanding what matters right now, there's some great examples in here at the top line. Are we optimizing for growth right now, or are we concerned with managing cash flow? And that leads to more obvious answers to smaller questions. So understanding at the top line, hey, we all agree, we all know what it is that we're driving for and focusing on, allows us to not sort of debate lower level questions, right? Like, sure, they'll come up or we might ask questions about them, but the answers tend to be more obvious when you know at a top level, this is what we're driving for, right? And each of these, I think, there's been different points in this company where we've moved between these buckets, and being clear about where we were, which I will confess, we weren't always clear about which of these states we were in, right? Like, are we most concerned about specific top line revenue, or is it building and expanding the customer base? Which one of those things do we care about right now, right? Are we willing to take on technical debt right now because it's super crucial that we deliver some capabilities that are going to make a difference in the market? Or do we have a little more time and we are looking to build something that's super foundational, and we're going to make an investment, or we're going to pay down some of that technical debt that we've taken on because things are working well in a different part of the business? And really understanding that overall allows us to come to the table with more useful suggestions instead of coming to the table sort of at odds with each other.
Rob, real quick, there was actually a question that came up pertaining to these metrics. And the question was around, sort of in that pivotal moment slide, the person who asked the question asked, hey, I would have expected to see revenue per employee, particularly for sort of software sector companies. Why wasn't that sort of included there? And I think I can take a moment and sort of answer that. I think really there are going to be different metrics that might pertain to different sectors, but ultimately, and revenue per employee, I would really think of that as sort of an efficiency metric that, and there are many efficiency metrics that you can look at, right? You've got, your sort of sales and marketing spend as a percentage of revenue. You have things like magic number, revenue per employee, rule of 40 is another kind of big one. And I think what we showed on that other slide were some of the highest level metrics that we would look at, from kind of revenue growth all the way to kind of high level efficiency metrics. Certainly, there will be a host of additional metrics that would also be looked at and monitored within the organization. But at the highest level, you want some metrics that really cover and kind of sweep across your entire P&L. But I think, revenue per employee is certainly an important one. It's helpful to track that over time. I would say it's something that it's one where you may not need to track it kind of daily or weekly or what have you, but seeing that trend over time is really helpful to understand whether you're kind of moving in that right direction overall. But I would say that that metric is sort of subsumed within some of the efficiency metrics, but certainly is an important one to track over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I would add one of the things when we went through that exercise that was really enlightening was looking at organizations in our space and the very top line, like percent spend on R&D versus total revenue, percent spend on sales and marketing versus total revenue. So one, just understanding these are appropriate levels at different stages of growth of an organization, which was really fascinating. And then two, that different organizations have different philosophies even at that level, right? Are we product led and we invest more in R&D, but then we draw down that sales and marketing expense, or the other way, are we really a more traditional sales organization and then we're investing less in R&D? Like, you can't have it all. And even at that very, very top level, as you look at organizations and say, oh, I see the difference in how they spend here, you probably know the organizations well enough if they're in your space to say, oh, that makes sense. I understand that's sort of the philosophy of this organization. And then as you get down to revenue per employee, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, there's a philosophical decision there too, which is overall, I'm spending, I'll just call it a bucket of cash for lack of a better expression, right? I'm spending an amount on an R&D organization because that's within the realm of what's going to get what's appropriate for our revenue. But as a leader, as a technical leader, and again, in partnership with your CFO, you're asking top line philosophical questions about how does that get made up? Do I really value very senior local engineers because that's the kind of problem that we have? Do I invest more in design? Do I invest less in design? So the cost of an individual employee might range significantly. And so my revenue per employee number might shift because I'm making up that overall pool of how I've built R&D in different ways. And I think understanding that philosophy is really critical, again, to this point of high level explicit goals, so that you're not making these decisions that, why is this engineer cost, this tiny fraction more than that engineer, versus do we have an understanding of how we believe we will most effectively deliver value to the company?
And that's such a great point. And it also, the other thing that can, make that metric a little bit tricky sometimes is if you are maybe spending on automation a bit more and it saves you on some headcount, there still is cost, but that doesn't necessarily factor into your denominator. So really understanding strategically what you want to do as a team really plays into this. Okay, so with that, I'm actually going to talk about a few high-level tools, if you will, that I would definitely want to share with CTOs and others who I speak with on the team to kind of provide some of that enablement, right, around how to think about spend. Because ultimately, the first step, right, is making sure we're aggressively aligned on the top level goals of the company, right? The long-term strategy, more from a, market positioning perspective, but then as well from a financial perspective, what do we want those highest level goals to look like? In order for executives across the board to be able to actually translate that into reality, there has to be some kind of, I think finer level tools to help make those day-to-day decisions. And so these 4 items here really kind of set across some things to think about, right? When you think about your spend and think about how you want to make investment decisions, right? The first one being sort of just defining and outlining what those trade-offs are. Am I better off In a particular case, having very senior engineers because I may need fewer of them versus having a larger pool of junior engineers. Does it make sense to do that? Or do I want to take more of a path to grow engineers over time within the company and have that matriculation? These are things that you want to think about within the team, or even higher level. Do I want to automate a certain set of tasks so that I can focus my engineers on, even more high value items? What are these different trade-offs that I should be considering? Or, hey, maybe I want to save money on, in one area. Can I take it from another place within my organization? Is there a way to have like fungibility within my budget so that I can have that flexibility over the course of a year? I think the other really important factor or item to think about is, what are our kind of threats and what are some of the impacts of investment decisions? And what I mean by threats are, if we don't make this investment, what's the risk that we face, right? Do we have competitive pressures that are, really like putting us in a position where we have to make certain investment decisions? Or are there other macro factors that we have to really consider that we may not have otherwise, right? So thinking about what those items are and the cost of not making the investment, I think becomes really critical as well. And then, of course, what is the expected impact? How do we know that what we're doing is going to help us get to the impact that we seek? And really outlining that and thinking about that before making the decisions help not only for an individual leader, but also for their own managers and others within their team to be able to think about, be able to employ that decision making more effectively. Anything to add to these two, Rob, before I get into the third and fourth?
I'm really excited to talk about the third one. So I let's jump into that, because that's where I feel like so much creativity around the knowledge work, the kind of high leverage points in engineering are. So I'm going to wait to comment until you're done with
there is so much to be said about this third one. No, when a dollar is not a dollar. And I'm going to just say it happens, or the way you think about this can happen at very different levels, right? So I think this one, I'll start off by saying, by being aligned across departments, kind of at the cross department level, you're able to actually save on a lot of these hidden costs that may otherwise come up. And what I mean by that is, Rob, you might say, hey, I might be better off hiring folks remotely, anywhere I can find great talent. I'm going to make that hire. There may be some cost benefits in certain regions and whatnot, but then you may not be cognizant of potential other costs that might be there, that might be actually faced by your finance team or G&A team, right? All of a sudden you have permanent establishment, or you've got taxes and other things that may come up with some of those decisions. So being able to understand kind of that holistic picture around investments become really helpful, right? To be able to manage those constraints more effectively at that kind of cross department level. And then, of course, within a given budget or department budget, there are also other kind of trade-offs, or dollar not really looking like a dollar, but maybe amounting to more. And I'd love to hear some of the things that you're thinking about in this particular.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you mentioned the remote thing. I mean, that's obviously very topical for people over the last few years. And I have stumbled a couple times in thinking about, it's access and sort of, it's the same, right? It's a dollar and there's fewer of them in this case versus, tax implications, et cetera. But now we kind of have the other thing, again, speaking of the last few years, where, we're saying what would be really valuable when I think about leverage is taking some of our cash from other players, maybe even some of our hires that we were considering, and moving that into getting people together, like spending money on travel so we can go see each other and sort of rebuild some of the personal relationships that I think over the last few years, hopefully, I mean, we're doing this on Zoom, but nevertheless, like, I spend all my day talking to people on video and I barely know anything about them. I mean, I've been surprised by the third dimension of people recently. And that is really, really hard to probably, quantify out in a spreadsheet, but you can feel it so quickly as you take a team that has formed, let's say, over the last couple of years and never even met each other, put them together for a week, and then they go apart again. But the difference in terms of their ability to function, their engagement, their happiness, their ability to deliver, all of those things shift rather quickly in a way that I think we're going to have to be thinking about a lot. It feels like very, very topical at this time, and I think if you look at many historical cycles of, economic downturns, et cetera, the first thing to go is travel budget, right? Well, we don't need to go see people, right? I think, at least in my history, and sadly, I've been around long enough to go through many of these, one of the first things to go out the window, whereas for us, it's been one of the first things where we say, what would really help, right? People are feeling exhausted. They're feeling taxed. They don't have this personal connection. Let's spend a little time, getting people together and building real relationships. And so I think there's many of those sorts of trade-offs that are not like, it's not, should I outsource this work or should I give it to someone in-house? Should I buy a product? Should we build it? It's like very big in terms of where you're looking differently to find a place where spending those same dollars is going to get you a very, very different return.
It's funny because typically, CFOs may be a little bit reluctant to make certain large dollar investments in software and whatnot. I totally understand being in that position, but another area where you've got this dollars not a dollar situation is if the investment you make may actually be much cheaper than trying to do some of these things in-house, right? As you said, like it might actually be worth the large spend to outsource certain things, even though it feels like it's an additive cost upfront, right? Not being able to quickly see how you can like reallocate your employees to other jobs, higher value tasks can make it a little bit obfuscated, make this investment decision a little bit harder to see, but ultimately may be the right thing for the organization. And then lastly, create clear boundaries and exit criteria for experiments. I think just because we are in a sort of a tougher environment, it doesn't mean we should stop experimenting or that we should stop making investments that are accretive or additive to the company. And I think that one of the ways around it is by really being able to establish some boundaries and timelines around these investments so that you can continue to explore ways to add to the company and to grow the top line. And so I love this idea of saying, okay, hey, why don't we try that out? You have a great idea. Why don't you try it out for 90 days? Let's see what the results are. Do a pre-post analysis and see what happens. And then if things go well, let's double down on it. And if not, let's pivot to the next experiment. And I think that we see a lot of benefits in doing this in a way that isn't overly expensive for the organization, but I think it does require a fair amount of discipline, right? You have to be very clear about, okay, we're going to stop it and shouldn't just linger on without that kind of finite constraint.
Exactly. And I think we're about to jump into some examples and sort of talk through some of our own experiences. But before we do that, one thing that I really want to highlight is, we're talking about this in the context of these challenging economic times that sort of force us to be more disciplined in these behaviors. The thing that I highlight a lot is don't lose that, right? You could call it the fortune, like we're forced into finding some of these patterns, being better at this. I mean, picking up on that, clear boundaries and exit criteria. Don't let that discipline slide when you have, when economic times shift. These are good behaviors. You shouldn't have long overruns where you're not totally clear what it was you were trying to achieve. That's never a good thing. It's just we're feeling a little bit more aware of it at the moment. And if you can build those practices and that muscle and discipline in these times, you'll be in a much better state when there is easier access to capital, when the market feels like it's growing faster, because you'll be moving faster than everyone else because you have these practices and this collaboration in place. All right, let's jump into the first one. So, we've alluded to it a little bit, and it's pretty classic, the build versus buy decision. And I think my thinking certainly has shifted over the last many years, not just in these particular times around this. And we talk, well, my opinion that was on the slide, undifferentiated heavy lifting. I often think less about dollar for dollar comparisons because so many of the costs are hidden over time, and more about what is it that we as a company are uniquely qualified to do? How are we differentiating ourselves in the market? And if it's not that, we probably shouldn't be building it ourselves, right? It's really, really hard to deliver great product. And if for us as CircleCI, I mean, we are not going to do a fantastically differentiated job of collecting credit cards. That's not what people are excited about doing. We have to do it well, but there are people who do that really well on our behalf, right? Or, the forgotten email or forgotten password email flow, right? We use Auth0 in the front of our product. It's been done. I mean, if you're really excited about building that thing, there are places you can go work that are focusing on building those things. But if the thing you're building, in our case, is continuous integration, leave those things to people who have done them really well. Take advantage of that. Focus on the thing that really matters. And that's true, again, as we think about building our product, and then it's true in tooling and capabilities underneath. And I think, I think it's very common as a tech leader to sit down and sketch out, oh, this is the cost, right? This is the sticker price of this thing. This is what it would take us from an engineering perspective. And first of all, we know we're always wrong about the engineering estimate. Like, we don't know where we're going to be wrong, but we know we're going to be wrong. And then, maintenance and knowledge transfer and all these things, like it almost isn't, I hate to say it, it doesn't feel like it's always a purely financial decision, right? It's because so much of it is hidden. And so much of it is distracting from the thing that you, again, as a business, are really trying to differentiate yourself on.
So Rob, I'm going to maybe not push back per se, but ask you a couple of questions on this particular topic, right? Like, I totally get, you want to outsource that which isn't strategic or core, or that's been done exceptionally well. One of the big topics of today is, well, vendor costs are rising quite a bit. How do you make sure you are not overspending? You may still do the product, but how do you make sure you're not overspending? What kind of discipline do you think is needed to make sure that, just because you're kind of cruising along with some outside software, that you don't, again, get complacent around those dollars?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think saying, it's valuable at any cost, absolutely a mistake. There's plenty of opportunity to, I'll say, build, I'm somewhere between negotiate and build great relationships. It's all of those things, right? And I actually think one of the places we struggle as like a software development industry as a whole is looking at something and saying, it only does 90% of what we need, so it won't work. So therefore, let's go build 100%, versus saying we can get some building blocks and augment with them, or getting something from a provider and then saying, oh, it doesn't do exactly what we need, so we'll build a little bit on top, and we'll build a little bit, and we sort of like end up doing the build and buy, which doesn't feel very fiscally responsible. You get kind of the worst of both worlds. But I would say you should absolutely understand the cost. And I think or the value, the return on that cost. But I would say, I guess there's two things. Generally, I'm hard pressed to come up with an example of a place where the cost is ridiculous. Where I look at it and think that doesn't even add up. It's more common that I'm thinking, oh, that seems quite reasonable. When I actually take the full scope of what the financial impact is of building something, right? And I think that, again, my perspective has shifted, because when I was a young, enthusiastic software engineer, everything looked really simple, but I didn't necessarily see the long-term maintenance burden, the complexity of deprecating these features and building these features and shifting demands and if we use the credit card example again, just compliance needs and all this back end. I mean, you mentioned doing things that we don't necessarily recognize that it adds to G&A, right? Like there's a whole bunch of other stuff. I could take a customer's credit card, but then, managing
data privacy.
Right. But the privacy concerns like
Yeah,
revenue recognition, all of this stuff that is not part of the scope of what I'm thinking about when I say, oh yeah, we could totally do that. And it would be faster, it would be cheaper, it would be exactly what our customers want, et cetera. And then all of that energy, like it starts to expand. So the cost balloons over time, and that energy is being taken away from delivering what I actually want to deliver for my customers. Right. So absolutely, like, don't be fooled by the, first year discount is one important thing. Like as you're thinking about it, because the next year now you're stuck and it's growing, like, pay attention, be disciplined. Don't sort of just buy everything, but choose wisely between where you can really have impact for your customers and where you're sort of burning time and energy building something that's been built before.
Yeah, I mean, I think the dollar is not a dollar question comes up quite a bit both ways, right? It's not just on the vendor side, but as well internally, there are probably a lot more costs than we think of. The maintenance is a big one, right? I mean, it's exciting to build a product the first time, but then when you all of a sudden have to own that forever, and the upkeep of it can be quite challenging.
That's right. And I think the types of engineers that are enthusiastic, hopefully you can recognize that I'm speaking from personal experience. The types of engineers that are enthusiastic about building that first thing aren't necessarily considering the longer term, maintenance overhead. Well, it feels like a good segue into another sort of place that speaking of ballooning costs over time, the early discounts, the enticing offers to go somewhere else, we've definitely looked at this question a bunch of times. We've had this conversation many, many times. We already use multiple cloud providers, but if we went over here, it would be this tiny fraction cheaper. If we went over here, we would get this, et cetera. And it's massive. I don't know a company any company that uses the cloud. I don't know a company for whom the discussion of cloud spend isn't a hot topic.
It's a hard one, right? And I would say that it's one that you really do have to start off with that strategic question, right? Of first of all, yes, it's an actual cost line item for many companies, but for some companies, especially tech companies, it can also be a very important strategic question, right? Do we need to be multi-cloud for some strategic purpose, or is there some sort of maybe competitive dynamic at play that you have to be thinking about, right? So I think answering the question at that level becomes really important, at least from a kind of multi-year, longer term perspective. And then I think dissecting the financial impact of it and the costs associated with it becomes at least a little bit easier. It still doesn't become totally easy, but it gives you some constraint to sort of filter down the scope of that problem. But then to your point, right, these are hard decisions. This usually involves a heavy lift. It may involve a lot of internal engineers to make this type of decision. If you were to kind of fully change, is there a way to get a benefit by maybe not going all in, but maybe parsing things out a little bit? I think it's one that's really multi-level type of problem.
And I would say from our own experience, I feel like this is a great example, or it feels almost backwards, where the mental model would be, okay, CFO, finance department, whatever, have a spreadsheet that says we use this much compute and we can get this discount from this other cloud provider, therefore we should switch, right? And the engineering team is trying to explain that's really hard, it takes a lot of work, and I feel like in our case, at least in one sort of time that I'm thinking of, we said we could probably make it happen, and it does feel like it would be really valuable, to you as the finance organization. Is that important? And really getting the feedback, I can tell by the look on your face that this terrifies you, right? From like a work and implementation perspective, one, I feel like there's a higher risk here than you're really comfortable stating, and two, explain to me the opportunity cost. If we took all of that same energy and put it into value that we're building for our customers, what would be the return there? Because I'd rather see us, again, knowing what kind of economic time are we in, et cetera, I'd rather see us grow the top line by delivering customer value than, right now increase cost of goods by, doing a massive cloud shift or whatever, which is really going to take a bunch of our energy and incorporate, again, all this risk that I could see on your face. And, in that case, we made the call. It's close enough. Like, what can we get done with contracts and negotiation, get us into a better spot and not invest all of this engineering time, which is really a high value and can be applied somewhere else. The other thing that I think is really interesting from an engineering financial perspective on cloud providers, it comes up in a bunch of different cases, is you can use them as a commodity, right? I get storage and compute, or you can go all in, right? I use if we're talking AWS, like I use DynamoDB, which means I can't move off of that unless I actually go rewrite software, as opposed to I just deploy it in this environment. Again, that feels like a commodity to me. And I think that's one that a lot of people grapple with because it reduces optionality, but it increases velocity, right? I can move faster if I take advantage of everything that AWS offers me instead of just treating it like a bunch of computers. And I'm curious, actually, it's a thing that we've never been grappled with because we sell a server product which has to install in many different environments. So we have to sort of treat it as a commodity, but that's not a conscious decision that we've ever had to make. And I'm curious how you would think about that if we were faced with it today.
Yeah, no, I think that, but first I was going to say that this particular topic of cloud spend is one where, I talked a little bit earlier about how finance team CFOs should really kind of educate the team at large about the financial metrics and goals and whatnot. But I think this is one in which, from our perspective, I know I learned a ton from the engineering team and being able to kind of come in with that greater understanding around the why behind why we go with a certain vendor or a certain set of vendors, why we may not just do something for the sake of several points of improvement on a discount, I think was very illuminating, right? And it kind of gets the teams aligned. This is another area where, at first the starting point may have been, finance organization rolling their eye at the spend and going, what are we doing? To, okay, I get it. I understand what the trade-offs are, what the sort of overhead is to make these types of changes. So I just wanted to mention that it was a great experience to sort of get educated on this sort of very technical aspect of our business. But, to your point around, how should we think about optionality? I think I'll save this because it probably comes into play with one of our other examples that we're going to talk about. So I'll just hold.
All right.
Now.
Well, I love all these examples, and I feel like we're gonna have to get through them faster if we're gonna get to the end here. But so we talked about this one a little bit. Like, do we hire? Are we hiring for sort of local collaboration or specific skills that have been developed? I mean, we're a Bay Area company, so certainly there's a massive talent pool that has very specific skills in sort of large organizations, stuff like that. Or are we sort of optimizing for cost per employee, right? Which is where most offshoring comes from, and whether it's offshore, different markets, or just full distribution access to anyone, right? How do we make that decision? And I think I would come back to the overall spend, right? As an R&D perspective, from an R&D perspective, what do we spend as a total, percentage of revenue? What's appropriate? And then can we align on a philosophy? Because once we have that philosophy, then the decisions of who and where get a lot easier. If you end up debating cities, what about this city? What about that city, sort of thing, then it's a sign that you're not trying to solve the same problem.
Yeah, and I think where teams often get stuck is in looking at this question in a with a short-term view, right? Many times as you get into an annual planning cycle or what have you, you think about the immediate year cost constraints, right? But I think in order to effectively sort of think about a question of this magnitude is, where do we want to be in 24 months or 36 months, and how do we kind of work towards that in a manner that's practical, right? I think many times it's not practical to completely change your geographies. And I think all companies are grappling with that right now after having gone largely remote during COVID and whatnot. How do you really think about what your longer term view might be?
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out, and I will highlight, because a real example that's come up for us as well, and something we've learned over time, is philosophically, it sounds wonderful to say, I'll get access to talent wherever it is, right?
Yeah.
We'll be so much better because we can get the cream of the crop, in any geography. But one thing that we've seen over time, because we've sort of experimented with all of it, is that critical mass from a effort to attract and retain talent is actually really important, right? So if we can invest in a particular area and have a network of connections and access to other people and brand recognition, the overhead to our sourcing team, our recruiting team, like those sorts of people, gets a lot lower. We can even put someone in that region and say, hey, you're local, you're an expert, you'll be able to connect with people, go to local meetups. A lot of that value, I think, gets overlooked with this assumption that the work starts once the person is in the door, and everything before that was kind of easy. But I mean, any technical leader knows hiring is not easy. Finding great people is not easy. And there are impacts, to your point, of longer term. Like if we want to invest in an area and build up, we're going to get a return, and an even better and better return over time as we build some momentum there. Whereas if we're hiring one-off in kind of every location, absolutely we can support that. But those folks are typically coming to us because we met them some other way, not because we have access to the global economic or the global sort of talent pool, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, but really being thoughtful around this helps to not only get the team that you need, but it also helps the other supporting functions around you be able to most effectively and most cost effectively support the initiatives as well.
Absolutely. All right. Last example. I mean, last example for today, but as you and I both know, there are many places where this comes up. But this has always been a really interesting one to me, and certainly coming from a more technical background, this dollar, when is a dollar not a dollar, like that whole question comes up, I think, as a common thread throughout. But a little bit of the optionality, like usually you get a deeper discount by signing a longer term contract, right? Whether that's at the super high level of your cloud spend and a longer term commitment, down to simple tools that you're trying out, right? And sometimes it'd be really unlikely that we would move off of this. I mean, it's just not worth it. But often you don't, and you like the value, right? Or you want to just be able to reposition that cash in the future. And so I think the question is always interesting, but I honestly, this feels like one where I still come and ask literally every time, hey, we're thinking about this thing. Does this feel like a time when we would make a long-term investment and commit, or do we want some flexibility and we're willing to spend the cash? And so would love to get your, now I really want to know, like the high level, so that I can make these decisions without asking every time.
Yeah. So I think generally my starting point for most contracts is not multi-year, right? The default sort of position is like, let's not do multi-year. But I think there are times where it may make sense, right? Because, and I would say that there are a few categories that I would think of, or a few areas that I would try to evaluate. I think the first is, okay, generally with multi-year agreements, right, you have to commit to some level of usage or seats or what have you over the course of those 3 years. So really being able to have some confidence around your projections of usage, or how you're going to actually use this product over 3 years, or whatever it may be, becomes really important, right? Because you don't want to, again, overcommit, but at the same time, if you undercommit, it kind of takes away from the point of why you kind of enter into these types of agreements to begin with. So I think one is if you don't have a really solid ability to forecast your usage of this product, that's sort of a red flag to me, right? You want to feel really confident on that piece. And then the second part of it is this something that you need, right? Is it the type of product where it's actually very hard to move off of, right? Or you don't have that flexibility, and it's so core to the business that it's something you're definitely going to need over the long term. I think that's another kind of check that I would want to make sure is there, right? Is this something where optionality maybe is kind of, maybe there isn't much optionality around this particular item, therefore you feel better about it. And I think that also helps with why you might, as an organization, want to commit to a multi-year contract, right? It's something where you actually want some of that price protection because you're going to need this product. But if it's something where you don't necessarily know that for sure you're going to need it for several years, maybe the price protection just isn't that valuable of an item. So it really just depends on how critical it is and how well you can actually forecast into the future. Those are the things that I would the lens I would look at these deals through. But generally speaking, I would think there wouldn't be that many of them. There'd probably be a handful of these types of, I would say outside spend that would fall into that category and meet both of those criteria to actually be able to enter into. Because at the end of the day, right, it's a liability, it's a commitment that you're making, and generally it's a large financial commitment. So, I think this is where the finance team can really help with, is this something that is going to, put us in a bad light, in terms of for investment or what have you? Like, is this a commitment that's just too risky? That's something that that team can be able to help support. But I think as a department leader, it's really about, do I definitely need that? Do I know that I'm going to need this and I don't have that much choice? And is it something where I can effectively forecast through periods of volatility?
Love it. Well, now I feel less bad about always asking the same question, because it is complex. But I think it's a fantastic point to wrap with the examples and jump into the sort of takeaways, which is these are the kinds of places where it's not super obvious, and this is why leave the conversation for these hard questions, right? Don't assume my CFO is just going to push me back on the number and push me back on the number. Therefore, the discount is the most important thing. But rather, there are these other side effects that I don't necessarily, I can't think through all the time of what does it mean to us to carry this risk as a business, this liability that I'm overcommitted or that I'm committed long-term to this thing. And therefore, as an organization, that's worse than paying a little bit more, on a one-year term sort of thing. That's I think it's easy from the outside to assume, to your early point of just being the gatekeeper, the financial police, as long as I'm spending less, we're doing better, and missing the point of some of these, these subtleties about what it means to make these commitments.
Absolutely. So just a quick reminder, I guess you covered that, but, some of the things you can look through, and then ultimately starting off with that high level picture so everyone is aligned, I think goes a really long way. And it actually would save to any CFOs out there, would save a lot of time on your part, right? The more you can sort of share the direction, share the numbers, and actually provide that on an ongoing basis to others within the organization.
So there was another question, just as I think we can just wrap with this one question because we're running right up against time, but it was about the dollar is not a dollar topic. Unsurprising. I think that's the one that's where all the sort of depth and nuance is. And basically says, we talked about hidden costs, cross-organization, et cetera. Can you comment on hard dollars versus soft dollars and how you think about that?
So I'm going to interpret the hard dollars, meaning those that are sort of on the bill of the investment that you're looking at, and maybe the soft dollars is all those extras, intangibles that are a little bit harder to see. I think this is something that most CFOs and finance teams are actually have antenna for. It comes naturally, strangely, to those teams. So just being able to, I think, for if you have a doubt as a non-finance person as to whether there might be some additional soft costs, just sort of, I would say, bring these up and ask ask folks, right? Like I think for things like headcount, the obvious questions to ask are, are there going to be additional costs for traveling that will have to be incurred? Are there, supporting roles that will need to be hired if you don't hire a particular profile? I think these are some natural questions you may want to ask, at least from a headcount perspective. And I think that things you may want to ask, your finance business partners or whomever are there costs that maybe other teams might have to incur because we are taking this particular approach to something? By doing this, does that mean we're going to need, X, Y, and Z other roles to help support because we're not taking that on? Or is it something that, we're taking more of a full stack approach? So I think like just being conscious that there could be other costs depending on the nature of the investment, I think is the starting point. And then it's just a question of engaging the right people to actually identify what those other costs might be. I hope I answered that question.
Feels right to me, but you're the expert. Well, thank you, everybody. We're a minute over, so we'll wrap it up. Chitra, always a pleasure to hang out, to chat. I think people can tell we do this often. Thanks to everybody for joining and listening in.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day, everyone.